He wasn't supposed to follow her, but that day, the billionaire did. Daniel Reed moved through his Lagos mansion the same way he moved through life, controlled, distant, unreachable. Every morning at 6:45 a.m., the staff lined up like perfectly arranged chess pieces. They greeted him with stiff backs and nervous smiles, each one terrified of becoming the next example of his cold intolerance. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His silence did the work for him, sharp enough to slice through anyone who displeased him. Amara was the only one who didn't shrink from him, not because she was bold, but because she kept her head down so thoroughly that she barely noticed the storm he carried. She moved softly, gently, her presence so quiet, Daniel often forgot she existed. But that morning, fate made her visible in the most uncomfortable way. Daniel turned a corner, distracted by a call from a board member complaining about a shipment delay. At the same moment, Amara rushed forward with a tray of folded linens, her mind focused on finishing tasks before the others mocked her again. They collided. The linens flew. Amara gasped. Daniel stopped dead. "Watch where you're going," he snapped, not loudly, but with a sharpness that cut deeper. "I don't pay you to be careless." The hallway froze. Amara lowered her head quickly, whispering a trembled apology. Behind her, 3 staff members exchanged smirks, the kind that said finally, "Someone else is getting the heat." As she bent to pick up the linens, Daniel walked away, already forgetting the encounter. But the moment stuck to Amara like dust she couldn't sweep off. All day, she heard little whispers. "She thinks she can walk freely. Quiet doesn't mean innocent. Beggar girl should watch herself." Amara didn't respond. She rarely did. She simply kept working, mopping floors, dusting corners, organizing Daniel's massive library. What none of them knew was that she carried a burden far heavier than anyone in that mansion could imagine. Daniel Reed, however, began noticing something new, something he couldn't explain. Every evening after the mansion had settled and laughter from the kitchen died down, Amara stayed behind. She moved through the leftovers carefully, quietly packing bread, rice, and small pieces of fruit into a nylon bag. She wasn't stealing. Daniel knew what theft looked like. She took only what would have been thrown away. At first, he assumed she was hoarding food because she was hungry. But then he noticed she never ate a single thing, not a bite. Not even when her stomach growled loud enough for him to hear once as she swept near the dining hall. That contradiction stayed with him. One night, he watched her from the tall glass window of his office. Amara's shoulders sagged with exhaustion as she packed a small portion of rice into her usual nylon bag. There was something tender in the way she wrapped it, almost like she was preparing a gift for someone she cared for. Daniel leaned back in his leather chair, frowning. He didn't like mysteries, not in business, and certainly not in his home. Mysteries meant loss of control, and control was the only thing that kept him balanced. But the more he tried to ignore her strange habit, the more it pulled at him. Who was she giving the food to? Why did she refuse to eat? What was she hiding? Daniel hated questions he couldn't answer. His pride told him to forget it. His discipline told him it wasn't his business. But his curiosity, an emotion he hadn't felt in years, refused to be silent. So, on a quiet night when the mansion drifted into stillness and the street lamps outside flickered like distant stars, Daniel Reed stood from his chair, slid his watch onto his wrist, and made a decision that would shatter everything he thought he knew about himself. He decided to follow Amara, secretly, without warning, without understanding why. And that single decision became the turning point of both their lives, though neither of them knew it yet. Daniel waited until Amara stepped out of the mansion before moving. She walked fast, her shoulders tight, clutching that same nylon bag as though it were holding her entire world together. The compound lights cast long shadows across the ground, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel wasn't thinking about profits, board meetings, or the stock market. He was thinking about a girl who barely spoke and why she carried leftovers like treasures. He slipped into the back seat of his black SUV. "Follow her," he murmured to his driver. "Slowly, no headlights." The old Daniel, the man who demanded efficiency and precision, would never have said such a thing. But tonight, instinct carried him. Curiosity pulled him like a thread. As Amara hurried down the road, crossing from the polished serenity of his gated estate into the chaos of Lagos nightlife, Daniel felt something flicker in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in years. Concern. Amara boarded a rattling yellow Kiki, hugging her bag protectively. Daniel's SUV stayed at a quiet distance, gliding behind them through busy roads and smoky Buka corners. Lagos looked different from inside an air-conditioned car, yet tonight Daniel saw it with new eyes. He noticed the cracked pavements, the flickering bulbs hanging from roadside kiosks, the tired expressions on people returning from work. The city felt heavier, rawer, and then the scenery changed. Street by street, the roads narrowed, street lamps became fewer. Houses grew smaller, clustered, leaning against one another, like tired bodies. Daniel frowned. This wasn't a neighborhood any of his workers should be finding their way into. "Are you sure she came this way, sir?" the driver whispered, uneasy. Daniel gave a slow nod. "Keep going." The Kiki stopped in front of a slum Daniel had only heard about on the news, an area reporters mentioned when speaking about poverty levels and government neglect. Amara stepped out quickly, adjusting her small bag. Daniel watched her slip into a narrow footpath lined with rusted roofs and puddles, reflecting faint moonlight. He stepped out of the SUV. The humid night wrapped around him instantly. A distant generator hummed. Children whispered somewhere in the dark. A stray dog barked. Daniel followed her carefully, keeping to the shadows, his expensive shoes sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth. Amara stopped at a tiny one-room shack patched with old iron sheets. The whole structure looked as though it had survived years of storms simply by refusing to collapse. She pushed the wooden door open and went inside. Daniel moved closer, slowly, cautiously, until he could see through a crack. What he saw stopped his breath. Inside, a frail woman, Mama Ruth, lay on a thin mat, coughing painfully into a cloth. Nearby, a small boy, Timmy, sat with wide, tired eyes that carried the weight of hunger Daniel had never known. The entire room smelled of dampness and sickness. Then Amara knelt. She unpacked the nylon bag gently. "Mama, I brought food," she whispered, her voice soft with a tenderness Daniel had never heard from her. She divided the bread and rice into 2 plates. Mama Ruth tried to push some food back toward Amara, but Amara shook her head quickly. "No, Mama, you and Timmy eat." Daniel's chest tightened. Amara wasn't stealing for herself. She wasn't hoarding food, she was starving, so that her mother and little brother could live. Timmy ate quickly, tears slipping down his cheeks, as though his body wasn't used to the comfort of a full bite. Mama Ruth reached for her daughter's face, murmuring blessings, even with her weak voice. And Amara, she smiled at them, a tired, fragile but genuine smile, the kind of smile only someone carrying unimaginable weight could still manage to give. Daniel pressed a hand to his chest without realizing it. Something inside him cracked, clean and painful. He felt shame wash over him, shame for the insult, shame for his assumptions, shame for the privilege he'd worn like armor. He stepped back slowly, heart pounding, the reality of her hidden life settling heavily on him. He had followed her seeking answers. But what he found would haunt him. The sun rose gently over the Reed mansion, but nothing about the morning felt gentle to Amara. She moved mechanically, sweeping the grand staircase with slow, shaky strokes. Sleep had barely touched her the night before. She kept replaying Mama Ruth's tired smile, Timmy's small hands clutching the plate, and the memory of footsteps she thought she imagined somewhere behind her on the narrow slum path. It lingered like a shadow she couldn't explain. Then she heard it. "Amara," Daniel's voice echoed through the massive lobby, firm enough to make the air tighten around her. She froze, the broom slipping slightly from her fingers. "My office. Now." Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. She swallowed hard, whispering a quick prayer under her breath. Nobody got summoned to Daniel Reed's office unless something serious had happened, and in her mind, there was only one explanation. He found out. Maybe someone told him she'd been packing leftovers. Maybe he thought she was stealing. Maybe he followed her and saw the shack, saw her shame, her poverty, her entire world she tried so desperately to hide. As she approached the office door, her palms grew damp. She pushed it open quietly. Daniel sat behind his desk, not typing, not signing documents, not reading reports, just staring at her, his face unreadable, his gaze steady in a way that made her knees wobble. She stood at the edge of the room, clutching her fingers. "Sir, I'm sorry if I followed you last night." The words hit her like a slap. Amara's breath broke. She stumbled backward slightly, hands flying to her mouth. "Sir, I didn't mean to. Please, I wasn't stealing. I swear." Her voice cracked. Tears rose instantly. Uninvited, she trembled so violently she had to grip the chair beside her for balance. Shame flooded her. He saw everything: her home, her mother, the cracked roof, the thin walls, her brother's hunger, all the things she wished no one ever had to witness. "I'm sorry," she whispered, head bowing. "Please don't fire me. I just wanted them to eat." Daniel lifted a hand gently, nothing like the cold, sharp gestures he was known for. This time it was soft, almost protective. "You did nothing wrong." Silence filled the room, thick and emotional. Amara stared at him, confused, eyes shimmering with tears she couldn't stop. Daniel's own breath was uneven, the image of her kneeling beside her family replaying in painful loops. "I saw your mother," he said quietly. "Mama Ruth. And Timmy." His voice softened further, softer than anyone in the mansion had ever heard it. "I saw you give them everything while you went hungry." Amara pressed a trembling hand against her mouth as tears spilled freely now. She'd spent years being invisible, yet in the moment she least wanted to be seen, she was exposed completely. Daniel stood slowly and moved around the desk. "You go hungry so they can eat." He said it with something that sounded like disbelief and respect tangled together. "That is strength, Amara, real strength." She sobbed then, quiet, shaking sobs that came from a place deep inside, from the exhaustion of carrying too much for too long. Daniel reached into his drawer and returned with an envelope. But before handing it to her, he said the words that shattered every expectation she'd braced for. "You're no longer a maid here." Her head snapped up in shock. "From today," Daniel continued, "you work directly under me, with proper pay, real pay, the kind you deserve." Amara covered her face with both hands and broke into uncontrollable tears. Relief, shock, gratitude, it all mixed until she could barely breathe. Daniel gently placed the envelope in her hands. She ran home that evening, her legs barely keeping up with her hope. When Mama Ruth opened the envelope, she gasped, pressing a trembling hand to her chest. Blessings poured from her lips faster than Amara could catch them. Timmy ate with a joy that broke and healed Amara at the same time. And far away, alone in his office, Daniel Reed stared out the window, quiet, thoughtful, shaken. The girl he insulted, ignored, and underestimated had somehow changed something in him. Something he didn't know was still alive. Her quiet strength had exposed the emptiness he'd been carrying for years. A week passed, but the heaviness in Amara's heart didn't completely fade. The envelope Daniel had given her brought relief. Yes, Mama Ruth's medicine was bought, Timmy had eaten until he smiled himself to sleep, and the shack felt lighter, warmer. But one truth remained. Poverty didn't disappear overnight. Bags of rice finished, medicine ran out, Life still pressed on. So that morning, when a sleek black car rolled slowly to a stop outside their tiny shack, Amara's first instinct was fear. She stepped outside cautiously, wiping her hands on her wrapper. A well-dressed driver stepped out and approached her respectfully. "Madam Amara?" Her breath hitched. No one had ever addressed her like that. "Yes, sir," she whispered. The man handed her a small, jingling bunch of keys. "These are for you." Amara blinked, completely stunned. I don't understand." The driver gave a small, warm smile. "Mr. Reed said you and your family deserve a real home." Her knees nearly buckled. She stared at the keys, confusion and disbelief mixing into something too heavy to hold. "A home?" Her voice cracked. "For us?" "Yes, ma'am, please, come." He opened the car door gently, as though she were royalty. Timmy came running barefoot from inside the shack, clutching a half-eaten biscuit. "Auntie Ama, who is that?" he asked, eyes wide. Mama Ruth stepped out too, leaning on the doorway, coughing softly. Amara reached for both of them with trembling hands. "Come," she whispered, choking back emotion. Someone did something for us." The ride was silent, filled with awe. Lagos Street sped past, the noisy stalls, the shouting hawkers, the smell of roasted corn, and then slowly, quietly, they drifted into a part of the city Amara had never stepped foot in. Clean roads, fresh sidewalks, painted fences. The car stopped in front of a modest but beautiful new apartment building. Not luxury, but safety, warmth, dignity. When the driver opened the door, Amara held her breath. Inside, the apartment glowed with soft light bouncing off fresh cream-colored paint. The floor was tiled. The air smelled of newness, like hope finally allowed to breathe. Real beds, 2 in one room, 1 in another. A small living space with a sofa, running water flowing clearly from the tap. A bathroom with a real shower, a refrigerator humming gently. Nothing extravagant, just life-changing. Timmy ran across the room yelling, "Mama! Mama, look! My own bed!" His little voice squeaked with joy as he jumped on the mattress, giggling as though the world had turned into magic. Mama Ruth leaned on the doorway of the bedroom, tears wetting her cheeks. God has remembered us," she whispered. But it was Amara who broke first. Her hands pressed against her face as she sank to her knees, sobbing, loud, shaking sobs that came from years of holding pain in her chest. Mama Ruth knelt beside her, holding her close, even with her weak arms. "My daughter," she whispered, "blessings will never leave your path." For the first time in years, Amara felt safe, safe enough to cry without fear, safe enough to breathe deeply, safe enough to hope. Outside, parked at a quiet distance, Daniel Reed sat in the back of his SUV, watching through the window. He had told the driver not to announce him. He didn't want credit. He wanted them to feel dignity, not debt. And when he saw Amara kneeling in gratitude, tears escaping her eyes like unspoken prayers, something inside him trembled. He wiped a tear discreetly. "No one who sacrifices," he whispered, "should ever suffer alone." His driver glanced at him through the mirror, but Daniel looked away, pretending not to feel what he felt. As the engine hummed softly, Daniel realized something profound. Money could build mansions, but kindness built people, and this time he chose people. Amara's pride was restored. Mama Ruth's health held new hope. Timmy finally tasted childhood, and Daniel, quiet, complicated Daniel, discovered the fragile humanity he had buried for years. The girl he insulted had changed his heart without even knowing. Sometimes the smallest acts of compassion create the biggest transformations. Amara's story reminds us that kindness doesn't need witnesses, it simply needs intention. Her quiet sacrifices lit a path she never imagined, showing that even in the hardest seasons, hope can find its way through. And Daniel's awakening teaches that wealth means nothing without humanity. Wherever you are listening from, remember, your generosity, your patience, your small acts of love, they matter more than you think. You've got this. If this story touched you, please like, subscribe, share, and comment your key lesson below. Your perspective might inspire someone else.